All right.
All right, so we'll get started here, and for the purposes of this, we can just have a chat. We'll forget about the camera. You don't have to look at it.
No, that's fine.
And then if you can include the question in your answer, that would be ideal. So to start off here, would you tell us your name for the record and then spell it?
Yeah, my name is John Harp Cote. Harp's a nickname that somebody gave me when I was very young. Actually, later became the county attorney, a gentleman by the name of Morris Hennessy. But we were playing, I moved from the east side of Butte to the west side of Butte by the Lincoln School, and I was playing in the yard, and I come over with the cap on, and I had overalls on with this. And he thought I looked like a little Irishman, and I had all the freckles I have now, and he started calling me Harp. And it used to be the Little Harp. Now it's just Harp.
Can we move that mic up just a little
Oh,
bit?
yeah, you bet. Sorry. Would you mind?
No.
Yeah, that's great.
Is that better?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Will that work? Okay, perfect. And where and when were you born?
I was born in Butte, Montana. You asked, should I say, you asked when I was born, or I just tell you? I was born in Butte, Montana in October 26, 1923.
And have you lived in Butte your whole life?
Most of my life. I spent 4 years, or almost 4 years in the Navy, and then I went to work for New York Life. 1950 and 1958. I was transferred to Boise, Idaho, and then Seattle, and then Portland. I had an opportunity to come back home, and I did, and I've been here ever since.
That's great. And are you married?
Married, yes, I am married, and I have 8 children. I had 8 children. We lost 3 of them, but we have 5 living, doing well.
And what's your wife's name?
Esther. Her name was Sullivan. Pretty Irish also.
Sure.
Yeah.
And no, come on back. So, could you tell us a little bit about? Are you okay? About what you've done work-wise, what jobs you've had over the years?
Well, yeah. When I was in high school, I did the paper boy and things that normal kids do. I delivered papers for a while, and then, but starting in my work years, after I got out of when I graduated from high school, 1942, and I volunteered for the Navy Air Corps, not the Navy, the Navy Air Corps. The Navy Air Corps went to Seattle, got as far as Seattle. I found I had a perforated eardrum, so they wouldn't accept me. Told me to go home. I'd probably be 4F, but they lied. And so I went home and I went to work at the Leonard Mine, and I really didn't intend to be a miner all my life, but that was what was available. And
sorry to keep bugging you guys. Jimmy Lynch is wondering about his Calcutta ticket.
He got one. He'll pick it up there, Tone.
He'll have it ready for you there. That's the Calcutta.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry, it may just be rubbing against the coat. So.
Maybe on the coat itself.
Okay.
Put it on the coat. Where the hell? Oh, here it is.
Oh, you got it.
Put it on. So where you think it should be. Okay. That better? All right.
So you came back to Butte?
I came back to Butte after, and then, where was I? I went to work in the mine for 6 months, and to get enough money to go to school, I went back to, myself and 2 other young men went back to D.C., and we started at George Washington University. We both had, all 3 of us had a job. I had a job as a doorman on the Senate, and the other 2 were Capitol policemen. And I always say and reflect back, doorman at the U.S. Senate was probably one of the best jobs I ever had, because I used to go to, I got off at noon. I didn't have to be there till noon because I was going to school, and I used to recess at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So I didn't have to work too hard. And I got to meet everybody that had to come into the Senate. And back in those days, I was single, and we met a lot of young girls, young ladies. So it was kind of fun. But I kept getting letters from kids in Butte here that they were going into service, and I felt maybe that's what I should try again, see if I could get in. So I volunteered for the Navy, not the Navy Air Corps, and they accepted me. I went in the Navy. I spent over almost 4 years in the Navy. 20 months, 20 or 21 months of that was in the South Pacific on board ship, the USS San Juan. And then the fleet, they started to take people from the fleet to go to officers candidate school, and I was chosen to go to officers candidate school, and they sent me to Princeton. I was at Princeton for a while, and they found I had an irregular pulse, and they sent me to the hospital and kept checking on my irregular pulse. And I finally, the war ended while I was in there, and I decided that either get me out of the hospital or discharge me, because I had enough points to get. I had a point system back in those days, and you had a certain amount of points and you were allowed to get out. So I got out and I come home, and I was 22, maybe I wasn't 23 yet. I was probably 22 years old, and myself and another young man named Tucker McGree opened up a bar in Meaderville. And we had quite a place, really. Back in those days, Butte was kind of a wide open town. And we were in Meaderville, and it was even more wide open because they never closed at 2 o'clock like the law said you had to do in the city of Butte. They were in the county, and they stayed open till whenever they needed to, and the customers left, they left. And so I spent, Tuck and I ran that bar, and it not only did we have a bar, but they had gambling and everything back in those days. We had, in our place, we had a crap game, 21 table, and a roulette wheel, and probably 10 or 12 slot machines. And it was a fun deal, and we were both single and had a lot of fun at it. But Tuck got married, and I could see this was no life to be married in, so we sold the place, and I started to look around at what I wanted to do, and I knew I liked people. I liked to be around people. And so I decided to go into selling. And I went to work for New York Life. And here it is, that was in January of 1950, and I'm still represent the New York, I don't sell anymore, but I'm a consultant for New York Life, some 62 years later.
Wow.
So
it was a good fit.
But I'm here. And that's pretty much my work history.
That's great. What can you tell us about your ancestors? Do you know when they left Ireland?
Well, my mother was, well, I don't know exactly when they left Ireland, but my oldest uncle was born in Boston, and he was born in 1889 or 1890. He was born in Boston, so it was sometime before that. And my grandfather came over before that, of course, because he met his wife. My grandmother was, they didn't get married. They got married in this country. she came to this country and he came to this country, and they met in Boston, and they were married, and then they moved to Montana. And he was a kind of a peaceful guy, so he probably was here quite a while before they got married, because he had a brother who was in the 1916 rebellion. I mean, and he joined the monastery because he didn't want to get hung, I guess. But he had a brother that's in the monastery, and was in the monastery in Ireland. Yeah.
Wow. Do you know where they left from? Where they're from?
Yeah, my grandfather was from County Cork, and what's the island? What the hell's the name of it? Bear?
Yes.
What are they? Bear? Is that what they call it? Yeah, that's where he was from. And my grandmother was from Mayo, God help her. Ain't that what they say? From Mayo, God help her. She was from County Mayo. Yeah.
Wow. That's great. Do you know how your parents met?
No, the only thing I know, my grandmother was a chambermaid, and my grandfather was a very, very good carpenter. He was an excellent carpenter. And his family in Ireland must have all been carpenters, because the brother who stayed there lived in the monastery. When I went back to Ireland and went to look at it, Mount Mallory was the name of the monastery, and there was a fellow there that showed me around, showed me he was buried there, and they showed me his grave, and then they showed me the work he'd done. He'd built a lot of the chapel, and he was excellent, could tell, he just had to be an excellent carpenter, very fine finished work, yeah.
That's great. What does your Irish ancestry mean to you?
Well, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm Irish and French. I am proud of both of them, because I think the Irish. We talk more about the Irish because they had more problems. I mean, than the French did, and my French parents were here a long time too, because they had, well, my father would be 100 and something, and he was born in this country.
And what did your father do to
My father was, when he was younger, he was a jockey. And not on the horses, but the little buggies, whatever they call it, kind of a, he did that. He was never a very big guy. He weighed about 125 pounds, I think, was all. And then he later went and became a jeweler, and he was a jeweler, and he made that ring.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a gorgeous piece.
Yeah. The three pieces, not the gold around it. My mother put that around it later on. When I got out of the Navy. She wanted me to have the ring, but it was a dinner ring for a woman at first, and my dad was putting the gold on, so it's been my wedding ring now. My mother gave it to my bride, and my bride gave it to me.
That's
yeah.
So. Wow. What do you know about your family name?
Well, I don't know a hell of a lot about the Irish name. I know there's a lot of Walshes. That was my mother's name, was Anna Mary Walsh. My grandfather was a Walsh, and my grandmother was a Murphy. So, but I never really dug into that. My father-in-law used to always say, don't dig too far into your background. You might find more than you're looking for. I think that's true in many cases.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And is Cote?
It's French name. It's Cote, and it's very French. There's a slash, but we don't use it. Cote sounds a lot better in Butte, Montana than Cote. Fact of the matter, the same guy that named me Harp, I was general manager out in Seattle. This was before and I've been back 30 or some years, but like I told you, New York Life sent me to Boise, then Portland, and Seattle, and I was in Seattle, and Maury Hennessy was the guy's name, and he was our county attorney here, and he came up to the New York Life office, and he says, "Is Harp Cote around?" And the girl said, "Gee, we don't have any Harp Cote. We have a John Cote." Well, he never did let me forget it. When I come back to Butte, he used to say, "Oh, there goes Mr. Cote." And he'd give me hell all the time.
That's great. Do you know if there are any traditional first names or nicknames in your family?
Well, I know most of my uncles' names, but I don't know that most of them went by. Well, Theodore went by Ted, and Emmett went by Emmy, and John was John, and Dave was Dave, and so no, I don't think they had any really nicknames.
Sure. What do you remember about your childhood growing up here?
Well, remember a lot about it. I was born down on the east side across from the Grant School, and my grandfather, my Irish grandfather, had moved to, well, my French grandfather died, incidentally, and we can talk about him later, but my Irish grandfather was in San Francisco, and he moved back, and we lived in a little house on the east side, and he thought we should have a bigger house, and him and my mother went over on Granite Street. The house is still there, and there was a house there, and they paid $500 for the house. And he went in and remodeled it and fixed it all up, and we lived there. Well, like I say, we moved there in 29 or 30, 1929, and we lived there until we lived there part-time. Part of the time we lived out the Flourmile with my French grandmother, but we lived there until, even when I was in high school, we lived over on West Granite Street. So.
Do you remember your neighbors?
Yeah, there was, the Altmans lived on one side. It was Jack Altman. I don't know what his dad's name was, wasn't Jack, but he was a printer for the Butte Daily Post. Line sitter, printer, I don't know what they call him. He was on one side. And on the other, well, it wasn't on the very next door neighbor, but up a couple doors was a gentleman, a friend of my grandfather's. His name was Mike Milan. He was well, fact of the matter, I think was Bob McCarthy, who used to be the county attorney here, his grandfather. Mike Milan, great old Irishman, and they lived up. My grandfather and him used to visit once in a while together, you know. And let's see, who else? There was several across the street were the Weinstocks. They were a Jewish family. They lived in apartments across the street, but we lived on the corner of Granite and Clark, and they had a big apartment house on the other, Granite and Clark on the north side. And the Weinstocks lived there. And
were there quite a few kids in your neighborhood?
Yeah, there was. Yeah, my neighborhood included what we called a hub edition, and we had a skating rink up there and everything. And in the hub edition were the McGarrys. They used to call them I better not. They might be finding this out, and one of them might come back to haunt me. But they did call. There was 12 kids. They called them the Dirty Dozens. They were a bunch of tough kids. And they had 12 children. And then the Crumbies, they lived across the street. Now, they were on Court Street, and I'm on Granite, but they were on Quartz, which they lived in the 600 block on Quartz, and we lived in the 700 block on Granite. And the Crumbies lived on Court Street, or I don't know if it's like they had a house that didn't face Granite faced Crystal Street. And let's see, who else? Johnny Haig, I don't know what Johnny, he was older than we were, and he was kind of the, well, he was older, and he was the con man in the crowd. We all had a lot of, but he was probably 5, 6 years older than us.
What sorts of things would you guys get up to when you were a kid?
More problems than we, no, we were pretty good kids. I mean, we played, I know one time we decided we wanted to, there was this shop between Broadway and Granite, and a couple of us decided we'd like to go in and work some of the tools, you know, and we snuck in and was using them, and we got caught. And boy, my grandfather he was livid, because tools, as a carpenter, but they didn't send us to jail or nothing, but we got quite a scare. And at that time, that was a little earlier. Then later on, I don't know what we did, but Davy O'Connor was the guy's name. He was the probation officer, and he used to stutter a little bit. Then we he picked 2 or 3 of us up for something. I don't really, we didn't do anything bad, because we didn't, not real bad, because we didn't do anything. They just took us up and kind of frightened us, I suppose, and let us go. And one of the kids started to laugh when he was stuttering, and boy, he got mad. Stuttering Davy O'Connor, we call them. Mean kids, you know.
Sure. Did you all play sports?
Yes, all through, grade school and high school. St. Patrick's had I went to the Catholic school, St. Patrick's, and we start in the 6th grade, we were playing football. 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I played football. And then I also played in high school in my junior and senior year, 2 years. As a sophomore, I was on the team, but I didn't play much, but I was on the team. Sure. And we played basketball. And when we were younger, we played a lot of kick the can and games like I don't know, they don't seem to play them much anymore, the kids, but.
It doesn't seem like it. I did when I was little, but.
Yeah, the kids now, I don't ever see them. They get too busy watching TV.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember there being a tradition of storytelling at all in your house, or
storytelling?
Or music?
No, well, my father used to tell me some stories, and we had I love to relate. It's a true story, and I always relate to the fact that, in some ways, I'm like my grandfather, Cote. He came down as a woodcutter from Canada to the mines. They cut the wood, they used wood in the mines and he came down and worked as a woodcutter. And now, I don't know this, but I know what happened. I think he's like me. He figured that's a lot of hard work, cutting wood. So he opened up a saloon. Oh, and he accidentally, what do we call it? He got 160 acres.
Homestead?
Homestead. He homesteaded.
Okay.
Homesteaded out by the 4 Mile, right where Walmart is right now. Mm-hmm. On that, going all the way up to the hill up there where the railroad used to go, and he owned the ground where the railroad did. And anyway, he ran this saloon and he did all right in the saloon, but along comes prohibition. They were going to start prohibition, and he was a thinker. He thought, well, geez, this is maybe a chance to. So he went, and just shortly before this, and I'm getting ahead of the story, shortly before this, the Milwaukee Railroad came through, and they bought the ground off of him because he had homesteaded it. And they give him $8,000, which I suppose back in that days was a hell of a lot of money. I mean, you know, it was a lot of money, I would think. And what does he do with it? But he decides to buy whiskey, store it, bootleg. He was going to be a bootlegger. I don't hope they can't pull him out the grave there. No, I'm just kidding. But so he bought all this whiskey, and he stored in. They had a big spud cellar, and he stored it all. And the revenuers got him, broke up all the whiskey, and he decided then, the hell with, I'm not going to do anything. He decided he wasn't going to work. He was mad at the world. This is what my dad tells me. He decided maybe he'd just not work anymore. He could, they had this house at the 4 Mile. It was a log house and was later made into different things. But there's a picture of it in the archives up there when they tore it down, when Walmart came in there, the picture of the log cabin that they lived in. But he decided that he wasn't going to work anymore, and so they had a cow and they raised chickens and that. And my dad had this one brother that was younger than him, and he come running in one day, and the only thing his name was Napoleon, so you know he was pretty French. that was his name, Napoleon Cote. And so he decided he wasn't going to work anymore, and he just sat in a rocking chair, and he didn't do much. And every day he milked the cow, and that was about it. And one day, his youngest son, Joseph, come in, and he said, Dad, the cow's dead, the cow's dead. And he never missed a stroke. He said, good, now I don't have to milk it anymore. It was the only source of milk. And so, yeah, I always say I'm like him. I mean, as long as there's something else to do, why work, you know. So,
that's great. Wow, what a story.
Well, it's a true story,
yeah.
too, because, yeah.
That's so great.
And then we lived right across from the cemetery there. On, well, you know, where not the Holy Cross Cemetery, it's the other cemetery. And for a while I lived with them, with my grandmother and my father and grandfather. We lived in that house. And we lived right across. I had an uncle by the name of Medrick who was paralyzed. He was in a wheelchair all the time, and I must have been very young. They tell this story about me. I don't know if it's true, but Medrick became very ill, and he was going to die, so they told me Uncle Med might die. And so I went in and I said, Uncle Med, I understand you're going to die. And he didn't say much, but I said, but that's good. We don't have to carry you very far. It's right across the street. So my mother clobbered me for that, although she never did clobber me. She was a great lady. So, but you're talking about stories. I thought I should tell.
What do you remember about your mother?
My mother was. I can't say enough about my mother. My mother was one of the hardest working women I've ever known. I mean, she did everything she had to do to make a living. I mean, as my dad later on, after he became a jeweler, he gave that up and he went in, he was tending bar, and then he ended up running a pan game in Walker's, Pangingi game. And my dad, you know, he was kind of like my grandfather. He didn't really think should work too hard, but he was a great guy, and he had some great sayings. Yeah, I can always remember some of the fabulous sayings, and I lived by them. He used to say, if you're going to be a sucker, be a quiet one. And if you are a sucker, only a sucker beats. Suckers are, and he said, one of his ones that I do live by, he used to say, go first class if it's only for a minute. He just didn't believe in being second class or being something. But my mother worked very hard. She was a great woman. and very kind woman, generous woman. When she died, she gave me a notebook. This is a true story too. She gave me a notebook, and this was she died in 59, 60, somewhere in there. And she'd been in business. My father and her ran a bar, but my father wasn't well, so she ran the saloon, the Milwaukee Bar, down there on the corner of 2nd and Montana Street. She ran that. Well, we ran the format for a long time. My mother worked there and ran that. But she gave me a list, she gave me a book, and she said, Jack, this is people who, if you ever need it or want it, they should give it back, because money I've given to them. And it was $40,000 or $50,000 worth of money that she'd given to different people in town, lending them, and never got it back. And I never did. I burned the book too, because I didn't think I wanted to get involved. But she was just a great woman, and she had a heart attack. They put her in the hospital, and told her, you know, she was heavy. She should have probably lost weight, and she enjoyed eating, and she didn't want to lose that much weight, but she worked hard and scrubbed the walls. She did everything, you know. Well, I don't know, you know, but there's a story on that one too. The Clark Mansion, my mother bought that from. She lived in it for years, and that's where she died, was in the Clark Mansion. But she, again, showing her, there was a guy in the real estate business. My memory, I can't remember names as good as I used to. What the hell was his name? But he came to her and he said, Anna, he said, the bishop has given me the Clark Mansion to sell. I don't know if you know it, but the Clark Mansion, when W.A. Clark, before he died, he sold it to Hanson, from Hanson Packing Company. And then Hanson heirs or something, they were in a serious accident. He was going to remodel it and fix it up and live in it. But him and Frank Reardon and the guy that owned the Pierce Arrow Company in Butte were in a serious wreck, and the guy from the Pierce Arrow was killed, and Hanson was very ill. And Reardon was the only one, and Reardon ended up owning Reardon Plumbing Company here, and it was here for years. But anyway, the mansion, I can't think of its name, the realtor, but he said to my mother, he said, Anna, would you do me a favor? And she says, what was that? And she said, would you come and look at the Clark Mansion? He said, no, I don't expect you to buy it, but she says, the bishop has given it to me to sell. I can't get anybody to even look at it, never mind sell it to him. And he's coming in next week, and I don't want to lie to the bishop. And I have to tell him, well, I've showed it to a couple people, and I'll tell him I've showed it to you in case he asks you to tell him, yeah. And so she said, yeah, well, again, good Ann, she'd do anything to help. So she goes and looks at the mansion, but she falls in love with it. She thinks it's fabulous. And she bought the mansion for $15,000. And it was starting to be, the nuns had, I don't know if you know the history of the Clark Mansion, but when Clark sold it to the Hanson, then the Hanson estates, when he died, gave it to the bishop in Helena. And the bishop ended up, the nuns lived in it for years. And it's interesting, if you go up there today, you see, there's one room that used to have naked dollies, little Cupid dolls with no clothes on. And the nuns painted them, painted some clothes on. Put them clothes, she did paint them, yeah. So, it's kind of an interesting thing, but something about my mom. She was just a good person. She was a hard worker. Oh, and when she had the heart attack, they said, Ann, you go home, take care of yourself. Don't be scrubbing walls and doing all the things you do. You'll live for another 20 years. She says, well, I'm going home, but if I can't scrub walls and do, oh, they said to her, get somebody to wait on you. She says, I don't want people to wait on me if I can't do it myself. I'm just assume he did. And so she went home, did her own thing, and within a year she did some more things, and she had a heart attack and died. She died in, what the hell year was that? You know? Probably 1958 or 9. This is important, but she's been dead quite a while. Yeah.
So you grew up as part of a pretty recognizably Irish community, and
it was all not all. I shouldn't say that, but yeah. Where I lived on East Mercury Street wasn't Irish. It was a lot of Croatians and stuff lived down there. Down on Mercury and Galena and that, the Vaserviches and the Manoviches and a lot of Serbian and Orthodox people, Greek Orthodox lived down in there. And then on the Dublin Gulch, or up where the Hub Edition was a lot of Irish. It was mostly Irish. The McGarrys were all Irish, and the Colonels were Irish, and there was a lot of Irish there. And the French, a lot of my relations were, their name was Gay. They weren't gay, but their name was Gay, and they lived out, a lot of them lived out on the flat, further out, 8 miles, 7 miles. They had, well, there's Redferns, and they were, Mrs. Redfern was a Gay. And they had a little milk farm out there, and they had 2 or 3 families out there. By the 9 mile, we're all French. And then the Irish also was a lot of them in the Boulevard, which, so it was quite a different variety, but it was many more Irish than there was anything else at the time, I think. 13 Catholic churches.
13? Wow.
When I was a kid.
Okay. I'm gonna let Brandon swap out a card here.